Oh, stop, wait. Don't cut that branch, you risk dieback. But now imagine that this is a trunk of 5 centimeters or 2 inches thick. And you take a saw and you cut it off here. Then all of a sudden in your tree you see this whole section dry off. Now this could be described as dieback, but it really isn't. Now of course I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's no such thing as dieback. But what I am going to say is that most people misunderstand dieback. Because what is dieback really? Dieback is the uncontrolled dying off of a trunk or a branch after you cut it off. This of course doesn't mean that every dying of a section of a branch is dieback. In fact, for most pruning problems that I see, the dieback or the so-called dieback is actually not dieback, but it is a predictable behavior of the branch on the tree that you're pruning. Particularly when you look at Japanese maple, if you look at videos, if you look on websites, you often see, watch out. If you prune that branch, there's a big risk of dieback. So put cut paste, don't do it in the growing season. All these reasons are there and people actually misunderstand the concept of dieback. Now if you look at a Japanese maple and you look at the branch, you see that there between the leaves there is space. And Japanese maple typically can only grow new branches from the places where there's leaf connected. Now if you cut right below a point where the leaves were, that means that all the way until the next leaves, there's no option for the branch to grow new side branches. So that section will predictably die. That's not dieback. That is just the drying in of a stump that is left after pruning. Real dieback is when at that node where a branch could grow, the tree is unable to stop the dying off and it then continues further down in the branch and you see parts of the bark dying off. You see one side might have a branch, the other side doesn't, and slowly it can go in further down the branch. Now what does this mean when you're growing out your own trees? Now look at a branch like this one, right? Here is a node. There are old leaf stumps here. And here's a node, here is a node. So in this whole section, not a single branch can form. If I cut right below at this point, then this whole section will dry back. Now at this stage you can clearly see I've cut it off here, it dries all the way to there. But now imagine that this is a trunk of 2 inches thick, of 5 centimeters or 2 inches thick. And you take a saw and you cut it off here. Then all of a sudden in your tree you see this whole section dry off. And then it could be tempting to say, ooh, dieback. But that is a risk with Japanese maple. Now these are sacrifice branches that are never ever going to stay on the tree. So it's not a problem because I'm going to cut it off all the way down below. In fact, this branch here down below is the one that I'm going to keep. And you see here are leaves, and it's a very short internode. That's only 2/3 of an inch, 2-3 centimeters. But down low here, there's another fairly long sacrifice branch, so I might have to prune back all the way into that butt. And there I have a 1/2 centimeter, 1/5 of an inch extension growth. This is ideal for the next trunk segment. This is what we mean when we're talking dieback. It was cut off here, this berberis, and then the trunk basically died all the way back. Here, here, and all the way into the base. And if you follow this part down all the way here, it goes all the way until it reaches the ground. So this whole part is dead. And what happened is probably the top is gone, so there's no nutrients flowing down into the roots. At the same time, the roots have been cut short and they are not providing any upflow either. So here all the life has just disappeared. It has slowly died back. Now if you look at the side, you see on this side a few of the branches have actually taken over, so this side of the trunk is all still alive. Now this is a typical case of dieback, and that is probably the result of a combination of both the big prune and taking it from the ground. Now if we look here at this Japanese maple, I cut the main trunk here at a slant. And this is healing over, but at the same time here a part of the bark has died off. Now this could be described as dieback, but it really isn't. Here is a node. This is where the branches grow from. And if I look from the side and the pot has... well, the pot is now merged ground underneath, so I can't actually show you. But basically, this is the first node from this point. So there's a node here, and there's a node here. And in between, there's no nodes. You can also see that here on this little branch, there's a node and there's a node. So left alone to grow, these branches create fairly long internodes. That's why when I cut it up to here, For the plant there was no reason to support any living tissue here. So slowly it dried in up to the next node, and there it has taken hold, and here as well. This is now going to close over fairly easily. This is not really dieback. This is natural, predictable dying of the bark after pruning. Now this pomegranate illustrates very nicely what dieback is like. If you look at this stump here, this was a side trunk that I cut off. And as this was dying off, there was nothing to stop the dieback, except for here this little side branch. And you can see here in the bark, this spiral, this is where the tree was actually dying back. Only here did the dieback stop on this side, and on the other side it goes almost up to soil level. This is dieback. This is where the sap flow that kept this branch alive was feeding the roots, and basically the bark had no more reason to stay alive. It's really interesting to see how trees respond to these big cuts. So this is a very nice little cherry that I air layered a few years ago, and at the time I had a nice taper here, but it had reverse taper, so I created new roots on them, and all went really well until I separated it. And at that point this side of the trunk died back. There were no living buds here, there were no roots on this side. This trunk had been cut earlier, and as a result the whole trunk section on this side died off. In fact, this bark is all dead, and I could probably peel it off now as well. You see, this just comes off with my nails. I can just pull it off. This is all dead. This is dieback. This is what dieback looks like. Now, how do you prevent dieback? In this case, there were no roots. There's not much you can do. Basically, because of this chop, this side had already very low sap flow. Now when I started layering it, I interrupted whatever was left there still at the roots. There was no active current sap flow. So one of the things that you can do when you want to avoid dieback is to make sure your tree is very healthy. Make sure it is happy, it is growing and it's pushing. Then, if you make a big cut like this, it is often best to make sure there's active branches growing already at the area that we want to have. And if there's no active growing branches, then you make the cut a little bit higher than where you want it to have, because you don't know exactly where the nodes might be on your branch. If you leave a little stub, then that can dry in and you get a branch growing. Of course, the combined action of this having been cut the year before and then me air layering this doesn't help. Make sure your tree is well established in a pot before you do big cuts. So for me the order is big cut, then work the roots. But leave at least a year between, so that if you have made a big cut, this part of the tree can settle itself, sap flow can reroute itself to the roots, and once these have caught up, then you can do the rest of the work on your roots. Now what you can tell here, this branch died back all the way up to the trunk. And why is that? Well, this is a Prunus muma, and Prunus muma doesn't backbud all that easily. It's quite hard to get ramification going, it's quite hard to get backbudding. So that also means if you prune a big branch off and the tree is not fully healthy and they don't backbud all that easily, then yes, the whole branch can die back into the trunk and maybe even continue down below the trunk. You see, this one is also dead. So once I start peeling the bark off here, it would not be surprising if in between these two branches there's no living tissue left. Now, however, the one that people always say is prone to dieback is right behind me here. And what we see here is that a big part of the branch has been cut off. In fact, this was the leader of the trunk, growing really tall, and I cut it off. And you see there's absolutely no dieback. In fact, if I peel this off, this is healing over quite nicely. So why is that? Well, that is because I looked at the bark. You see this tiny little line here, and that line defines the next node of the tree. That is where new buds can form. So I cut from one node to just above the next node. Of course, I left this to grow vigorously to make sure that the whole tree trunk stayed alive. Initially I made a perpendicular cut. A year later I made it skew. This also helps in avoiding the dieback.